Segue, to continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue, to make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
Segue, to move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue, to perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue, to make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello, everybody. For a long time, the issue of diversity in society has been a hotly debated one, not always in a clearly understood way. From race, affirmative action, and gender, we have moved to a much expanded discussion that includes culture, national origin, sexual orientation, and disability. So where are we now in these discussions? Is there an attainment of equality still a part of diversity goals for institutions? What can we do to make the workplace a better reflection of the world in which we live? To discuss this and other topics, we have assembled a group of experts, all of them faculty members at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. They are Dr. Saba Fatima, an expert on critical theories of race and a native of Karachi, Pakistan, and who lived in Saudi Arabia for 10 years. Professor Prince Wells, who teaches music and an expert in African American music. Dr. Isaac Blankson, a native of Ghana and who lived for several years in Norway. Dr. Florence Maatita, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice, who is an expert on race and ethnic relations. Dr. Abdulatif Hamad, a physicist and a native of the West Bank, Palestine. And Dr. Helena Gornfinkel, a native of Moscow, Russia, and who is a graduate from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Welcome to all of you to Segue.
Thank you.
Let me begin with you, Dr. Blankson, because you are from a country in Africa, Ghana, and most people tend to think that anything below the Sahara in Africa is the same. But even a country like yours has many different ethnic groups, they speak different languages, so there's a lot of diversity even within a small country in Africa.
Yes, extremely. And I don't want to speak for the entire continent because, again, we're very diverse. However, from where I'm from, the diversity that we see is not how it's defined here. Over there, when we talk about diversity, we're looking at, of course, tribal differences, ethnic differences. We are looking at white, black. We're looking at all the aspects that we overlook. And so I think our concept of diversity is broader than even in the United States. And that makes a big difference in terms of when I came here, I was surprised mostly because when people talk about diversity in this country, especially from my experience, it's mostly about black and white. You know, and even within black and white, it is the white Caucasians versus African Americans. And so I was reminded that I'm not part of that discussion at some point, you know, when I came here. So I think my experiences regarding diversity is totally different.
Now, you lived for several years in Norway, which is a much more homogeneous country. So how was your impression when you got there, and how do you feel you were treated just because you were from Africa?
Well, that was a big culture shock. I mean, I have to tell you that. I left Ghana, a totally different, black continent, and then I went to the other part of Europe, which is extremely white, and that was my first time out of my country, and it was very, very different. The food, the people, the buildings, everything looked different for me, apart from even the society and the culture and the mannerisms. However, I also found out that they were very more open than I expected. And I think partly also because the time that I went to Norway, it was a time that the country has actually opened up for immigrants to be part of their society. So they were very welcoming, which was surprising to me. And so I didn't really feel any discrimination at the time that I was there. I'll probably say I've even felt more discriminated against in the U.S. than in Norway, which would surprise a lot of people because you would think it's, but I think in Europe generally, especially in the northern part of Europe, they are more open. And maybe it has to do with the history of this country as well, but I was very, very well received in Norway.
Okay.
And to the point that even when we moved here, my wife still keeps asking me, why are we still here? Let's go back.
Dr. Gorfinkel, you were born in Moscow, Russia, and then moved to Israel. How was that transition for you? Because Israel is also a very diverse country in terms of the different ethnic groups, particular people coming from many different countries. Yeah. So tell us about that experience.
Well, yeah, I'm a traveler, you might say. As you said, I was born in the former Soviet Union. And that is, of course, a completely different country right now. And then I moved to Israel, became a student at the Hebrew University, which is an extremely diverse place. And then several years later, came to the US. And so I think that in various ways, I can speak to experiences of diversity and otherness, right? And being an outsider, being an insider, much more rare, I must say. And so what's important to me is that I can bring those experiences to bear on my teaching, because I teach critical theory, and we do disability studies, post-colonial studies, we do critical race studies, gender and sexuality studies. And so when I speak of experiences of otherness, the encounter with the other or diversity, I'm comfortable kind of inhabiting that space of otherness and trying to convey that to the students. And I think when you personalize it, it becomes easier for them to understand.
Now, in the former Soviet Union, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. True. And that is an experience that most people haven't really felt, because people relate that to the era of the Nazis and things like that, but actually this is something that has been going on in many countries for many years. Yeah. So how do you feel it was the transition for you, I would say, witnessing that kind of things to the homeland of the Jews?
Well, I could, for one, be accepted into the university, which would not necessarily have been the case in my place of birth because of quotas and exclusions. So that was actually quite a transition for me. And I started to learn about the background of my religious group, my people, only when I left my place of birth, because there discussing that particular background was completely off limits, if not illegal. So I think my sense of self has sort of changed and transitioned at that point. So that was one of the experiences that I can think of immediately.
Okay. Sabah, you were born in Pakistan, which is an Islamic country. You live also in Saudi Arabia, which is also an Islamic country. And some people think that all Islamic countries are the same in the way the society is set up, but that wasn't the case, as you yourself witnessed.
Yeah, I mean, Pakistan is much more, when I was growing up, it was much more open to diversity. My childhood in Saudi Arabia was great. It was wonderful. And when I moved so right after birth, I moved to Saudi Arabia. I was like a month old, and I moved to Saudi Arabia. And then when I was about 10, we moved back, and I hated being in Pakistan. I would cry for an entire year to go back home, what I considered normal. But now as an adult, and then my dad stayed back in Saudi Arabia, so we would visit him often. And I just went back to Saudi Arabia last March for a pilgrimage. And now as an adult, when I look back, I feel very bad for my mom, because I can't imagine living that many years in a country where she couldn't drive, where she couldn't go out by herself, where she couldn't take care of us in case of an emergency, as was once a case. And I mean, I'm hoping things are changing in Saudi Arabia, but from my experience from last March, it didn't look like it, and in my discussions with people, it didn't seem like it. Pakistan, on the other hand, it was a very, very open to women. You dress as you want, you do what you want, you have the jobs, the careers that you wish for. But there's different sorts of discrimination in Pakistan then. There's discrimination based on sectarian, what sect of Islam you belong to. So there's, Shia-Sunni sectarian violence. There's also discrimination against Ahmadis, who are a subsect in Islam that are present in Pakistan. Actually, Pakistan doesn't define them as Muslims. But the point is that there's different sorts of discrimination that happen in Pakistan that weren't present in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, there's different sorts of discrimination, mostly based on gender, I would say.
And it's interesting because in Pakistan, they have had a woman as a prime minister.
Yes. And I mean, I think she was there for 2 terms, and there are lots of women in very high positions of power. There are lots of female activists. I don't think having a woman leader is something that Pakistan is averse to at all, and we have more representation there than we have in the United States Senate and Congress. And even in the history of Islam, in that Indian subcontinent, we've had Muslim emperors who were female. Razia Sultana being one that I can think of right away. So having a female leader is not something that people are like, oh no, we can't have a woman leading us. But there is different, like I said, different sorts of discrimination about, how do you practice your religion? That's not the right way to practice, and so on and so forth. But not instituted by the state, thankfully. Yeah.
Dr. Hamad, a mistake that a lot of people make is to think that all Arabs are Muslims and all Muslims are Arabs. Is that something that you encounter even today in this country?
Well, to some extent, for maybe the uneducated person, that's the case, that's true. And the facts, actually, and the reality is this is not true. Actually, most of the Muslim population is not from an Arab descent, and they are not Arabs, actually. The Arabs actually are minority among Muslims. This is not true, actually. As I said, like if you take the example of Pakistan, India, even not a Muslim country, but we have probably over 160 million Muslims there. Talk about Indonesia, for example, Iran, and so many other countries. So the vast majority of Muslims actually are non-Arabs.
Now you have been living in this country for many years.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you felt a difference in the way people related to you after 9/11.
Personally, I did not feel a difference before or after, especially within the academia, within the institutions. However, within the society, in the street, in the market, not me in particular, but rather like Muslim women usually face more of issues in this relation, because they will be easily distinguished as Muslim. For example, if I'm walking in the street, nobody will probably think whether I'm a Muslim or not Muslim, what might be my origin. But when a Muslim woman, whether she's an Arab or a Pakistani or Indian or Indonesian, she has a veil in her head, that's when they encountered some problems. But that to some extent, calmed down after, immediately after 9/11, for a couple of years, there were lots of problems with Muslim women, specifically Muslim mosques and centers burned around the country. Unfortunately, people sometimes react with no rationale about certain incidents, and they just blame everybody that belongs to that race or ethnicity or that religion when something happened bad on the hands of certain religion or faith.
Okay. Professor Wells, one of the great things that happened in this country a few years ago was the election of Barack Obama, the first African American. However, there was an interesting discussion before he was elected president, when he became the candidate for the Democratic ticket, of some people saying that he was not black enough because his father was from Africa, his mother was white. Why do you think that discussion even came to the forefront at some point at that time?
That's a good question. I don't know where that I don't know where that question came from or who was questioning, if he was black enough. I never heard anyone African American say that, right? So it kind of sprung up in the media. I think it was something to breed some kind of divisiveness, just kind of divide and some kind of contention in the electorate to help undermine his ability to be elected. I never really thought it was a legitimate argument that he's not black enough. I don't know, maybe somebody else here could say something about it. I've never encountered that myself. I can tell you that, if you don't mind me digressing a bit.
Yeah, sure.
I've taken one of these genealogy DNA tests, and what I find and what some of the other people who I've spoken with, what we find is that for people in America, we're all pretty well mixed. I don't know what you would think in looking at me, what my racial breakdown would be, but I guarantee you it would surprise you. And if we went around a table, I don't know if you would say if I'm black enough or if Isaac is black enough, right? So I don't know what black enough means. I never had that thought. I never really spoke with anyone who thought he was black enough. I think it was more political in its origin.
Okay. Yeah. And talking about politics, something that happened after his election that people say, well, we have broken the race barrier. We can move now in a post-racial society. But the fact of the matter is that in certain quarters, we saw an increase in racial divisiveness and accusing him in a very subtle way of being black. And I don't know if in some ways he did really break barriers there, if this is going to have a lasting, I would say, impression or consequence in the long run.
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's all up in the air how it's going to be viewed. It was a miracle in the opinion of many African Americans that he was elected as president, by a majority vote. How it will be viewed, I mean, the reaction was severe. He was attacked for some trivial things. Even today, he can't behave right. Everything he does. I heard it said that if he stopped all wars, he would be criticized for ruining the defense industry. Right? So he just can't seem to do anything right in the eyes of some people. I think it's racially motivated. How we deal with that, I really don't know. I just don't know. But diversity and achieving diversity in America is something that is it has no easy answer, and we've got to struggle with it.
Okay. Dr. Matita, Professor Wells just said something about the mixture that is there everywhere. Mm-hmm. But you are a specific case in that regard because you are the product of a mixed couple. Can you tell us a little bit about that background so we can understand better your...
I'm trying to figure out my background too. No. My father's from Indonesia and was raised Christian in Indonesia, and my mother's from Mexico, and they both met in Southern California. And I grew up knowing that I was Mexican and Indonesian, and I still carry on a lot of that identity, not entirely sure what that means, but when I have discussions with my students, one of the classes I teach is race and ethnic relations, and I have them try to describe me, try to identify me, and we look at census data, and I said, how would I fill out these applications? And they get really confused, and I said, well, now you know what it's like, I have a little sense of what it's like for someone like me or for someone like their president. And if you look at, there's still all of these data coming out from the 2010 census, but these data are suggesting that one of the fastest growing populations is multiracial individuals, so people who are identifying and claiming more than one racial identity. And I think that these are really important numbers to look at, but they also raise really important questions about what do we mean when we talk about racial diversity. Because, you're absolutely right in saying that when we in this country think about diversity, we tend to focus on white American and black American. And these are very rigid boxes, very rigid categories, but what happens when we try to loosen up our understanding of what these racial designations really mean, and what do they mean for our president, what do they mean for our professors, what do they mean for our students? And I think these are really important questions that we need to address.
That's an important point, because I remember I'm a native from Venezuela, where the huge mix of white, blacks, and Native Americans. And when I came to this country, the first time I was asked race, I said human. I just couldn't understand there could be something different than that. But anyhow, now tell us about how do you feel in terms of identity, or how you have seen other people who are the product of mixed race to identify itself, because in this country there is this tendency of, yes, check this box. Yes. So how do you see that experience going on?
I mean, it's a very difficult decision because or a very difficult process, because on one hand, we have to belong to one, more than one box. It wasn't until 2000 when, we were filling out the census form that you could check more than one box. And still a very small minority of people, 2-point-something% of the American population, who identify themselves in terms of more than one race. But there's a lot of research that looks at multiracial identity and how people are able to kind of develop and manipulate these identities and form them and reform them in different situations. So there are some people who claim a biracial or a bicultural or multicultural identity. There are some people who align themselves more with one parent or the other, depending on the environment or the culture in which they live. So for example, I grew up in Los Angeles, very strong, present Mexican culture there. My mother's Mexican, and so I feel like I have a much stronger connection to my Mexican heritage than I do to my Indonesian heritage. So there are some folks who develop identities around that type of affiliation. There are some who choose more, just I'm going to go with either this identity or that identity. And and this does go to some of the problems with how we understand race as very structured and rigid, but what happens when you can't make that choice? What happens when, what would it hurt to have a more fluid and open understanding of what race really means? And some of my students really grapple with that too.
Well, talking about these things of categories,